If you want to hide something from a Negro, put it in a book. This is one of the most thought-provoking quotes that has ever been pondered on, especially within the black community. It's said to have come from Frederick Douglass, although many attribute it to Malcolm X. Still yet, the source of the statement isn't as important as the relevance of it. So let me ask you a question. Have you read anything good lately? Who, me? Man, I've been reading a lot. So many old references pertaining to mayhem, slaughter, and diabolical schemes and plots to run the less accepted from their places of birth. And I've been reading about disaster, deception, and ultimately blotting out of a people, and all long before America. These are some unprecedented historical references. And I gotta admit, I've gained a wealth of knowledge that remains as untaught history, specifically about the transatlantic slave trade, its conspiracies, its victims, its survivors, and ultimately what has been written about regarding the role of Christianity. All I'm going to say is brace yourself, because I'm about to show you once and for all who the Negroes of the transatlantic slavery and forced migration, as well as their descendants, are, and what is the significance of our role in history. As I lay before you forgotten pieces of our puzzle that have been hidden away in hopes that the sands of time might bury them out of sight and out of mind. Pay very close attention. Why are the Ashkenazi Jews so vitally important to history? And where did they come from? What if I could confirm for you that the slaves captured our ancestors were not just prisoners of warring tribes of savages? What if I could also show you the role that Christianity actually played in the enslavement of millions of our ancestors? As you prepare for this roller coaster ride of emotion, remember, nothing is ever what you thought it was. You know I want to talk about it. Let's go. Welcome to the Ruddy Brew. My name is T. Edge, and today we're talking about the real life matrix, the artificial world we've been indoctrinated into versus the real world that we've had hidden from us for the past 248 years. I'm going to try and cover in detail the black people in European lands and beyond prior to what we were made to believe was a 1619 transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to try and give account in detail the costs that Europe, America, and the enslaved paid to the exaction of piety. And finally, what the roles of the Ashkenazi Jews were and all of it. Without trying to prove a Khazar theory, I might add. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my newest subscribers for showing support. Listen, I know it's been a long time since I've dropped a video. But you all have stuck around patiently waiting for me to show up again, and I'm grateful. I've been doing much work behind the scenes because I know you all value accurate information. And as a part of the small community that we are, I always want to do my best to get the information correct the first time instead of always having to continuously double back from maintaining false narratives that have been circulating within the past 200 years. Now, if you're new here, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Before you do, wait until you've heard the presentation. But once you've heard it, don't forget to flip your phone to the side and click the little watermark in the corner down here. That's just to show your support. Now, with that being said, I know that at some point I'm going to bring up Christians and Jews and maybe even Muslims. So as a disclaimer, I'd like to say that I don't condone any racist or superiority ideologies. I believe that all individuals are created equal. Also, every man and woman are entitled to practice the religion of his or her choosing, and they shouldn't be discriminated against based upon their religious preferences. If at any time you feel you can debunk or disprove any of the information that I present in this video, please feel free to do so. The only thing that I ask is that you attack the information and not the presenter, which is me. So let's get going. In fact, let's start from the end. When thinking about the Jews, our 21st intellect goes directly to the Ashkenazim or the Polish Jews. However, many of them, in conversation with others who are discussing the original race of Jews, typically state that the original Jews were dark-skinned, maybe like Bin Laden. But, they say, with the rate of mixing, they can be found represented in all nations. Now, I have a problem with that statement, but not from a religious standpoint, because like I stated earlier, everyone gets to practice the religion of their choosing. The idea of there being religious Jews in every nation is indeed feasible. The problem I have is with the masses proclaiming that the Israelites can be of every nation and or every lineage, ethnically. Now, without resurrecting the paternal and maternal DNA straw man for a moment, answer the following question. How many Negroes can go to Israel right now and tell the Ashkenazi that they're their blood relatives, their family members, and they'll be immediately accepted with open arms, as family? Let me help you out. You can't. They can't. I mean, anyone could convert to Judaism and be accepted as a Jew, because Jew is a religious term. But Israelite or Hebrew is not a religious term. It's a familial designation or a claim of lineage. One thing that will never be able to be done is to say that one family is represented in every other family of the world. I mean, not from a position of bloodline. Sure, you could show your autosomal signatures, and some may even show a paternal or maternal lineage. But if you've not grown up in that family, that community, or that culture, let alone have a similar phenotype or share some phenotypical markers, you will not be classed or considered as a part of that population. But I don't want to get stuck trying to explain DNA. I mean, which many will do. Let's just take a look at the Ashkenazi Jews, because most times they only claim a religious affiliation, but sometimes they don't mince words when telling us that their DNA matches that of the original Levantine population. So, where did these men and women come from? We've already gone over the scripture a number of times, and to make it short, Ashkenaz is a descendant of Gomer, who descends from Noah's son, Japheth. And for the past 80 years, they've been explaining to us how the sons of Japheth have come to be known as Jews. With the active back and forth about the Khazar theory, whether it's debunked or not, they've claimed that they are the sons of Shem. Now, I've done a video in which I've taken the position that the Ashkenazim are members of the Germanic or Gothic tribes. Now, despite Dr. Michael Brown admitting that he's a Caucasian, he said this in another one of his videos. Fair use.
Where did the name Ashkenazi came from? So, a little over 1,000 years ago, as Jewish people scattered around the world had now emigrated in Europe and now were living in the Rhineland in Germany, they looked at the name Gomer in Genesis 10, and they connected Gomer with Germany, so they took on the identity of the name Ashkenaz. It has nothing to do with Ashkenaz in the Bible, which is a descendant of Japhet. It's just a name that was taken. Okay, it's that simple. Just like my last name Brown doesn't refer to the color of my skin or anything else. It was shortened from a Russian name when my grandfather came over at Ellis Island. The name got shortened to Brown. It's just a name. That's all it is. So the idea that Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Japhet is a myth, 100% false, zero truth to it. Just study the history, look into it, check the Bible dictionaries, encyclopedias.
So is what he said really the truth? Are the Ashkenazi Jews migrants to the land of Ashkenaz? I mean, he did say to go back and study the history, though. So I went and studied the history, and I found, I'm afraid to say, that Jews did migrate into the land of Ashkenaz. But it's not what you think. After all, this is the Matrix. So in my historical survey amongst the books I found, I'd like to begin with this book, The History of the Jews from the War with Rome to the Present Time, published in 1887 by Reverend H.C. Adams, Vicar or Leadership of the Roman Catholic Church of Old Shoreham. Allow me to be candid for a second. I would like to admit that I've overlooked much of this information when I've read it in the past. Now, however, being that I've found more information, more data that is verified, I've been able to connect a few more dots that I had previously missed. When it comes to this book, to be completely honest with you, this book is a tale of pitiless, spine-tingling, hair-raising, breathtaking, and daring horror and oppression. And let me just say, to remove the myth that any Jews were accepted in Europe prior to the 1700s, everywhere that the Jews went in Europe, they were persecuted. It didn't matter whether they were natural born or converts. There was absolutely no love for the Jews anywhere they lived in Europe or any other Catholic controlled jurisdiction outside of Europe. Let me just pull a few excerpts for you from this book. Let's first look at France in the 1300s. Beginning at the bottom of page 164, it reads, in 1239, there were riots in Paris and Orleans and other great cities on the old charge of crucifying boys at the Passover, in which property was wrecked and wholesale murders took place. At Ploermel in Brittany, the Duke of the country summoned an assembly of nobles and bishops, at which it was declared that agriculture was ruined by monstrous exaction of the Jews, and a series of laws were passed, which for injustice and cruelty exceed any ever put forth in any country. It was decreed that all debts to Jews should be canceled, that all Jews should be banished from the country, that no person who should kill a Jew should be liable to prosecution for it, and that no judge or magistrate should take cognizance of any such offense. A petition was further addressed to the King of France, requesting him to carry out the same regulation throughout his dominions. Or what about Italy in the 1300s and the 1400s? Beginning at the bottom of page 200. To avoid the persecution, which was imminent, they agreed to change their faith, conditionally on being allowed to intermarry with the noblest families in the kingdom. A good deal of indignation was excited by the permission, and this rose to a greater height when several relapses took place. To punish them, a monk at Trani buried a cross in a dunghill, and then accused a Jew belonging to the city of sacrilege. A riot was the result, in which not only the supposed criminal, but all his countrymen in the town were murdered. The outbreak extended to Naples, and similar scenes of bloodshed would have ensued if the authorities had not intervened. Alexander IV, the reigning pope issued a proclamation requiring the rioters to desist. The king and the nobles lent their authority, and the enmity was suppressed before much blood had been shed. If we go down to the bottom of page 201, it reads, Clement's successor, John the 12th, Clement's successor, John the 22nd, AD 1316, adopted a different policy toward the Jews. Having been incited to it, it is said by his sister, who accused them of having insulted a cross which was being carried in a procession in which she herself, in company with some bishops, was taking part. He straightway published an edict banishing all Jews from the territories of the church, but the edict was revoked soon afterward, Robert of Jerusalem having interceded in their behalf, and a bribe of 100,000 florins paid to the Pope's sister. I got some more. Hold on. Let's look at Germany and Italy in the 1400s. Let's start on page 220. In 1453, there were Jewish riots in various parts of Cilicia, and particularly in Breslau, where more than 40 Jews were burnt. In the following year, Ladislaus, king of Hungary, allowed his subjects to drive the Jews out of his dominions, seize on their houses and lands, and cancel all debts due to them. The only conditions he required of them in return for this permission was their making good to him the tribute which had been paid by the Jews. These outbreaks appear to have been caused, as was so frequently the case, both in previous and subsequent generations, by the influence of fanatical monks who made the tour of Central Europe, denouncing the Jews as the enemies of God and man, and calling on all Christian men to avert the displeasure of heaven by slaying and expelling them. A preacher named Capistran and his manner raised commons in Cilicia and in southern Germany. Bernard produced the same disastrous effects. In Styria, late in the century, the people petitioned Maximilian to be permitted to drive the Jews out, as their Hungarian neighbors had done in the previous generation. They alleged the old charge of kidnapping and murdering children, and offered him 30,000 florins as a compensation for the loss of the Jewish tribute. We read that they were expelled accordingly in 1496. Similar expulsions took place in Mentz, Nuremberg, and Trent. In the latter place, the accidental death of a child, attributed as usual to the Jews, was the cause of their banishment. Let me share this one. This one is, for those who say that they were willingly accepted in Africa. In this very same book, beginning on page 282, the authorities laid heavy burdens on them, and at times exacted large sums as subsidies, after a fashion which greatly resembled the dealings of the English and French sovereigns several centuries before. The lower orders looked on them with financial prejudice. Fanatical prejudice, and they were obliged to wear black turbans and boots of different color from those of the natives of the country. Yet their position, on the whole, was not unhappy. They were largely employed in the ironworks among the mountains of Morocco, as well as in building and agriculture. One feature in their history deserves special mention. In 1578, when the ill-fated expedition of Sebastian of Portugal took place, large numbers of Portuguese nobles and gentlemen were made prisoners and sold as slaves in the marketplaces of the chief towns of Morocco. Many of these were bought by Portuguese Jews, who must have been solely tempting to requite the injuries themselves and their fathers had received on these captives, who were wholly at their mercy. But they took a nobler revenge. They not only exacted no ransom of them, but allowed them to return to their homes, requiring of them no other condition than that of passing their word of honor that they would, on arriving in Portugal, remit to their former masters the sum that had been paid for their redemption from slavery. History has recorded few noble actions. Now, so that we'll be in place later, let me also read this excerpt discussing Holland in the 1600s. On page 292, it reads, "As the century advanced, increasing numbers of new Christians made their escape to the Low Countries, where they renounced the false profession that they had made and returned openly to their ancient worship. It has been already mentioned that in 1598, the first Jewish synagogue was built in Amsterdam. 10 or 12 years afterwards, the numbers had so increased that a second became necessary, and in 1618 a third. But it was not only the exiles from Spain and Portugal who crowded into Holland as a harbor of refuge. From many parts of Germany and the contiguous countries, whenever the flame of persecution broke out, as it was ever apt to do in the slightest provocation, the Jews, who had heard of the justice and favor shown to their countrymen by the Dutch, came to partake of it themselves. From Poland and Lithuania, again, thousands of Jews immigrated, driven from their homes by the ravages committed by the Cossacks, who, under the Shelniki, had risen against their Polish masters. A large portion of these settled in the United Provinces. One company, which consisted of 3,000, landed at Texel, and there were many others almost as numerous. After some inquiry, they were received at Amsterdam and permission given them to build a synagogue. Thus, the Jews of Holland were divided into two societies, which might be called the Spanish and the German synagogues. Their religious tenets were doubtless in complete harmony, but they had different usages and historical traditions, and they are said to have entertained mutual jealousies and enmities. Possibly the imposture of Rabbi Ziegler, one of the numerous adventurers who had claimed to be the Messiah, or his forerunner, may have done something to create the severance. Ziegler professed to have seen the promised deliverer at Strasbourg and assured his countrymen that as soon as they had declared their readiness to accept him, he would appear, destroy the kingdom of Christ, as he called the supremacy of the Gentiles, and extend his own from one end of the world to the other. The Messiah was also to hold a council at Constance, which would last for 12 years, and all religious difficulties would be composed at it. As the Messiah did not appear, Ziegler's followers were so far undeceived. But the mischief which his imposture had occasioned lasted long afterward. This epoch is remarkable for a demonstration of intolerant bigotry, not as heretofore evinced by the Christians against the Jews, but by the Jews against some of their own brethren. One would certainly have thought that they had had such convincing proof of the folly, to use no harsher term, or endeavoring to compel men by the infliction of disgrace and suffering to adopt or renounce a religious belief, that they would have obtained from such a course themselves. At their dealings with the two celebrities of this age, Uriel da Costa and Baruch Spinoza, exhibit an amount of harshness and injustice which their own persecutions could hardly have exceeded. Both these men were of Portuguese extraction and belonged to families which went by the name of New Christians. Both were remarkable for great mental activity and an unusually speculative turn of mind. The natural tendency was doubtless fostered by their own early experience. The truth or falsehood of every dogma of their belief having been, as it were, forced upon them as a matter of logical inquiry. Now, in this one, the Jews who did not convert were persecuting the Jews or new Christians who had converted. So it turns out that the Jews, known as the Portuguese Jews, were actually run into the land of Ashkenaz from Spain and Portugal, as we read in the above excerpts. So are these the people that Dr. Michael Brown and the Ashkenazi Jews descend from? Genetically, of course. Or are these the Jews that migrated into their territories and began converting the Central European communities? I can't refrain from thinking about the book written in 1850 by A. Barrington that says that the Jews of Spain and Portugal were always dark complexioned, and the German Jews looked like any other German. So if the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were run into Poland and the other Central European territories, it would make sense that they would be converting Europeans to their religion, right? Let's just say that my curiosity was intrigued by the information that is found beginning on page 331. Chapter 39, AD 1700 to 1800, Jews in Poland, the Chassidim, Frank Mendelssohn. And it reads, from the times of the Maccabees, if not earlier, to those of the impostor Sabbathi Sevi, Rabbinism had prevailed in the Jewish church. The only opposition had come from the Karaites, of which we have already spoken, and they were but a small sect, commanding little influence. Eminent Jews, again, such as Solomon ben Abraham of Montpellier in the 13th century, or Nathaniel Tribadi of Rome, or the more renowned Maimonides, might put forward opinions which the rabbins condemn, proceeding sometimes to the excommunication of the offending writers. But either the latter submitted or modified their opinions, or their judges reconsidered their decisions, and rabbinical theology continued in the main unaltered. But the followers of Sabbathi Sevi formed themselves into a distinct sect, calling themselves Jews indeed, and professing the principal doctrines of the Jewish faith, but differing from it at the same time in the most essential particulars. His followers, as we have seen, were not alienated by his apostasy or undeceived by his death. One prophet arose after another, who formed his own theological system, resembling Sabbatism in its general outline, but having peculiar and distinctive features of its own. Most of these secured during their lifetime, at all events, a large and enthusiastic following, while in some instances, their teaching was adopted as a rule of faith long after they had passed away from earth. Among these prophets, two of the most remarkable were Malach and Hagen. These men were two rabbins belonging, the one to a Polish and the other to a German synagogue, who AD 1700 had made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, there to announce the immediate coming of the Messiah. Most of their companions died of want or fatigue on the journey, and nearly all the survivors, following the example of Sabbathi, went over to Islamism. But the two leaders, and especially Hagen, zealously propagated their opinions, notwithstanding the most determined opposition of the rabbins of Jerusalem and Constantinople. Another and more important sect, appearing at least to derive its origin from Sabbatism, is that of the Chassidim, which established itself chiefly in Poland and Galicia and Russia. This is, according to a well-known writer of the present day, the religion of nearly all the Jews in Galicia, Hungary, southern Russia, and Wallachia. Its founder was one Israel Bel Shem, who first appeared in Podolia in 1740. He claimed to be the representative of God on earth, and as such, His commands were to be obeyed with implicit submission. His early history is full of fable, wild, extravagant tales being told of it, which are unworthy of repetition. The Orthodox rabbins say he was a man of mean rank and extraction, possessed of no real ability, and who affected sanctity and mystery in order to impress his followers. A certain supernatural power was invariably claimed by the students of Kabbalism, but those assumed by Israel had apparently no limit. He could absolve from all sin. He could cure all diseases by his simple command. He could work the most stupendous miracles. He was endowed with all knowledge, not only of the past, but of the future also. The main drift of his teaching, which entirely rejected the Talmud as a rabbinical tradition, was the necessity of learning by continual contemplation and self-mortification the true nature of God, and also of entire submission to the Zadokim, or priesthood. This excerpt, or this passage that I read, speaks of an impostor in the Jewish church named Sabbathi Sevi, whose followers, it says, formed themselves into a distinct sect, calling themselves Jews indeed, but differing from it at the same time in the most essential particulars. Other sources confirm that this man was a charlatan who went around conning the masses, and he created such an uproar that he was eventually arrested and imprisoned by the Sultan of Turkey for claiming the false identity as the Messiah and the unnecessary stirrings that he had created in his region. Now, I might add that he did later admit to being an imposter when the Sultan offered him freedom for the miracle of not dying. He was going to line him up before a firing squad, and the objective was for him to survive the arrows. But of course, he chose the alternative, which was to become a convert to Islam. And it says that he died 10 years later. But even after his death, his followers were not alienated, and he essentially opened the door for all kinds of cult followings. Now, on page 333, it says that there appeared another and more important sect, and it was called the Chassidim, which was established chiefly in Poland, Galatia, and Russia. Their leader was the famed Baal Shem, and this religion is known today as Hasidism, which was followed by the religion of Zoharism, headed by Jacob Frank in 1722. So to take a closer look at the Chassidim, I went looking for more old information about this sect. I found this book. I mean, it's more of a pamphlet, but it begins by telling us that this sect arose because they were against the contemporary rabbis of Eastern Europe, or the rabbis of Sabbatianism. And it calls them, and I quote, an emotional but uneducated people who didn't understand the Sabbatian expression of Judaism. It also confirms who exactly Baal Shem was. It tells of his origins, his education, and his doctrines. So, born in Romania, being self-taught, he, Baal Shem, was against the teachings of the rabbis. In short, when reading this pamphlet, we learn that the sect grew not just through regular popularity, but the popularity of persecution, which ensued because they didn't use sound reasoning to answer moral questions. This text admits that they were clever, but clever in making up rhetoric or lying to sound smart. Now, I'm not trying to disparage them, but how does a sect become popular because they're being teased for being highly emotional liars? I mean, are you telling me that this religion actually took shape because people were like who cares that you don't really know the tenets of this original religion? They shouldn't acknowledge that you're just making up things. But I'm not judging them. I promise I'm not judging them. I'm just asking questions, because I do understand that people get to practice the religion of their choice freely, and they certainly don't have to answer to me. But this group of Jews, again, is known today as the Hasidic Jews. And again, I'm not judging at all. I'm just relaying a message from these books and their history, like Dr. Brown advised us to. Now, of course, my curiosity didn't end there. I wanted to know more, because maybe these ladies and gentlemen were getting a bad rap. And dude, it looks really bad for a historical fact to be that your sect is basically... So, just to do a little more vetting, I went and I found this book, Sephardim, on the history of the Jews in Spain and Portugal, by James Finn, printed in London in 1841. Now, in this book, it confirms that the Jews who migrated from Spain and Portugal to Poland and Germany were called the Ashkenazim because they were a group of Hebrews or Portuguese Jews of the diaspora that had taken up residence in the lands of Polish and Germanic Europe. Here, they found a little more freedom, but as mentioned earlier, in these territories, they were still heavily persecuted. These Jews were different than the modern Ashkenazi Jews, being that the modern Jews are European, being themselves of Polish and Germanic origin. They're distinctly European, and it's verified by many of the DNA tests that they have online. So again, just to reiterate, the modern Ashkenazi Jews are non-Hebrews who proselyted into the religion that was started by a charlatan who later admitted, of course, to such, and he became a Muslim. And I got to keep saying this, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with practicing your religion. You get no hate or any pushback from me. It's just important to know where its origins are from. And again, this information is not information I made up, and you can actually see the sources that they come from. So I would like to not be called anti-Semitic by passing on information that's written in history. I mean, is that really something that can be used now, knowing that they're not really Shemites? I mean, I'm just asking a question. But listen, I understand that these days to be a Jew, one only needs to be born of a mother who is at least a convert to Judaism before she gives birth. These days, lineage doesn't determine who a Jew is. Yet, there was a time when lineage was the only way to determine who a Jew was. Because prior to the mid-1700s, it was a racial group and not a religious group. In fact, the term Jew was equivalent to the N-word prior to the 1700s. I mean, before the race was departed and exiled from the lands with heavy Roman Catholic leaning. And if we're really honest, the reason these almost cultic sects or cult-like groups gain a foothold in the territories of Ashkenaz is because they themselves had Catholic leaning, which made them more acceptable to the Christians. These acceptable qualities prevented them from being persecuted with the original Hebrews, who were in fact the exiles scattered to these territories. Now, over the course of time, these German Polish Jews, or as we know them today, Ashkenazi Jews, did migrate westward, and some of them ended up as far as England. I mean, continuing in the book, The History of the Jews, from the war with Rome to the present time, beginning on page 339, an account of the Jewish history in England after the times of persecution had become lax. It's laid out before us. Jews in England. During this century, no marked change of any kind took place in the position of the English Jews, though their affairs several times came before the notice of legislature. They had attained, under the Stuarts, liberty to carry on their public worship, to practice all trades and professions, and hold all property, except such as was not permitted to aliens. None of these privileges were withdrawn or modified during the 18th century. On the other hand, the Jews were not naturalized, could not possess land, could not hold any public office of whatsoever kind, were not, in any real sense, English citizens. Yet it was evident they regarded themselves as permanent settlers in the country. They began to build synagogues and to establish schools, hospitals, and other charitable foundations for the benefit of their community. It should be noted that, as in Holland, so in England also, there were two classes of Jews, the German and Polish, called Ashkenazim, and the Spanish and Portuguese, the Sephardim. These agree in their religious opinions, but in other matters differ considerably from each other. And it's said that intermarriages between them were for a long time rare. The last named were the first to erect the synagogue, which was opened in 1662 in King Street, Aldgate. In 1676, a larger synagogue had to be provided, and a third was built 3 years later. This stands in Bevis Marks and remains to this day, but little changed in appearance. In 1703, the Jews' Hospital was opened, which now stands in Mile End Road. In 1730, a girls' school was built by Isaac da Costa and called after his name. In 1735, another school for general education was set up and endowed by Ruiz Lamingo. The German and Polish Jews did not settle in England for a generation later. They were, on the whole, inferior in respect of culture and education, as well as less wealthy than their Spanish brethren. They provided themselves with a place of worship about the beginning of the last century. It was enlarged in 1722. The present Hamburg Synagogue was erected in 1726, and the Great Synagogue in Duke Street in 1763. Within the first paragraph, we are made aware of two very important facts. Number one, the Jews were not naturalized. They could not possess land, they could not hold public office of any kind, and they were not in any real sense citizens of England. Number two, there were two classes of Jews in England, just like in Holland. The German and Polish, known as Ashkenazim, and the Spanish and Portuguese, otherwise known as the Sephardim. And for a long time, intermarriage between these two classes were rare. And if we read on here on page 340, we learn that the Ashkenazi Jews didn't move into the area until a generation later than the Sephardic. And they were considered inferior, being less cultured, less educated, and less wealthy. And we do have other sources that clearly say that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were always black. Now, I'm just wondering, if there was no citizenship, then there were no laws. And if there were no laws that benefited them, it should be easily seen how it played to the benefit of the converts to proclaim Jewishness, but while implementing Christian practices. So to state it plainly, no, the modern day Ashkenazim, according to the history books that we were instructed to seek out, are not Jews of the Bible. They are converts to a sect that took on the epithet of Jew, but they formulated their own customs that included more prayer than study, clever explanations that were not backed by doctrine, the worship of their teachers, and their orthodox style of dress. So how did they achieve the notoriety that they now have? How did they become accepted by a government and society that left bodies of Jews just strode about the continent of Europe? According to this book, this is where the Rothschild name gains its acclaim to fame. And although this is not about the Rothschilds, it's important to note that they saw a gaping void created by the slave trade and Roman Catholics, and they took an opportunity. With that, we'll transition into the discussion of Christianity and the role that it played in the enslavement of our ancestors. Now, we've discussed in part one who the Ashkenazi Jews are and their relationship to the original race of Jews of Europe and how they transitioned into the position of prominence, the prominence that they hold in the West. That brings us to the role that Christianity actually played in all of this. But I beg of you, please, before you tune me out, just hear me out. I know that there are some people who are going to be offended when I begin talking about Christianity, but I need for you just to breathe for a minute. I need for people to understand that Christianity and Christ are not interchangeable words. Neither do they always support one another. All of us understand, or at least we should understand, that Christianity prior to America was Roman Catholicism. In many respects, Christianity is still referring to Catholicism. Our society is considered Western society, right? When news anchors speak about America, they commonly refer to us as the West, correct? You see, this is because America is an extension of Western Europe. And the religion of Western Europe, even today in 2024, is Roman Catholicism. Before there was an African Methodist, Episcopal, or Black Baptist Association or Pentecostal church, there was the movement known as Protestantism. And Protestantism ushered in all of these different denominations that we see today. Just think about it. Those that reformed the faith were protesting certain practices within Roman Catholicism. Prior to America, Christianity and Catholicism were synonymous terms. Christian did mean Catholic, and Catholic meant Christian. The sooner we accept that truth, the sooner we will be able to stop fighting about church history and dogma. Today, we think that Catholicism is a denomination, but in reality, it's the OG faith from the 4th century. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that no one should ever be Catholic or Roman Catholic ever again. Again, everybody gets to practice their religion. I'm just untangling a little truth. Because not even the reformers said to stop being Catholic. They only preached against some of the Catholic doctrines. And in some respects, they formed their own. I said all of that to show that Christian and Christ are not synonyms. But instead of getting into Protestants and Protestantism, let's deal with the chokehold that the Catholic and Roman Church had over all of Europe, particularly in respect to the Jews and the Mohammedans, or the Muslims. And yes, the Muslims did in fact take over Spain, and they attempted to conquer France, but they lived all throughout Europe, and they were known as Moors or Ishmaelites. Now, I know, being a member of the black community, that we've been taught that we are, or we were, the Moors in Europe. As a community, though, we're not. I mean, some of us did proselyte into the religion of the Moors or Ishmaelites, which is known today as Muslim. And again, just to reiterate, I'm not denying anyone the right to practice the religion of their choosing. But in Europe, you had Jews converting Christians and Muslims. You had Muslims converting Christians and Jews. But most important, especially for this segment, you had Christians converting Jews and Muslims, mostly by force. Now, I've noted in a few of my past videos that in 1492, the Jews and Moors were exiled from Spain and Portugal in 1495. But this expulsion edict was for the Jews who would not be baptized. Right off the bat, let's go into one of our sources. In the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic of Spain, by William H. Prescott, published in 1854, beginning on the last paragraph of page 262, it reads, "The edict for the expulsion of the Jews was signed by the Spanish sovereigns at Granada, March 30th, 1492. The preamble alleges, in vindication of the measure, the danger of allowing further intercourse between the Jews and their Christian subjects, in consequence of the incorrigible obstinacy with which the former persisted in their attempts to make converts of the latter to their own faith and to instruct them in their heretical rites, in open defiance of every legal prohibition and penalty." If we move over to page 263, it finally decrees that all unbaptized Jews of whatever sex, age, or condition should depart from the realm by the end of July next ensuing, prohibiting them from revisiting it on any pretext whatsoever, under penalty of death and confiscation of property. It was moreover interdicted to every subject to arbor, succor, or minister to the necessities of any Jew, after the expiration of the term limited for his departure. The persons and property of the Jews in the meantime were taken under the royal protection. They were allowed to dispose of their effects of every kind on their own account, and to carry the proceeds along with them in bills of exchange or merchandise, not prohibited, but neither in gold nor silver. Now, those mentions are a bit vague because Europe at the time had been persecuting under the pretense of protecting the faith for years, as noted in the first part of the video. The expulsion from Spain and Portugal led them to escape to other European countries where they met more persecution, death, and expulsion, which led to even more persecution, death, and expulsion. But here's the clincher. The persecution wasn't just for all the Jews as I originally suspected. The persecution and torture was for the Jews who had converted to Christianity but maintained their Hebrew or Jewish customs, which are included in pages 236 and 237 of the History of the Jews from the War with Rome to the present time. And to begin reading on page 236, it says, 3 inquisitors were appointed, Torquemada, Juglar, and de Avila. And their first act was to put forth an edict in which they declared to be the duty of all faithful Christians, without paying any regard to rank or condition, to accuse to the tribunal any whom they knew to be open professors but secret enemies of Christ. Any who did not do so became themselves amenable to the law for their criminal silence. To facilitate such accusations, a manifesto was issued in which various proofs were mentioned by which a secret Jew might be detected. We learned from it that a man might be accounted as a concealed Jew if, among many similar evidences, he 1. Put on clean clothes, or had clean tablecloth on the Saturday, or dispensed with the fire on the Friday night. 2. If he washed the blood from meat or examined the knife before slaying an animal. 3. If on the Day of Atonement he asked forgiveness of those whom he had offended, or put his hands on his children's heads to bless them without making the sign of the cross. 4. If he gave his children Jewish names. 5. If he ate the same meat as Jews or sat down to table with them. If, when dying, he turned his face to the wall or let anyone else turn it. If he washed a corpse with warm water. If he spoke approvingly of the dead, such person being a Jew, or made lamentation for him, or caused a body to be buried in virgin soil, etc. But that's not the only place that any such list is found. Here's another list. Returning to the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabel the Catholic, etc. Beginning on page 251. The presumptive proofs by which the charge of Judaism was established against the accused are so curious that a few of them may deserve notice. It was considered good evidence of the fact if the prisoner wore better clothes or cleaner linen on the Jewish Sabbath than other days of the week, if he had no fire in his house the preceding evening, if he sat at a table with Jews or ate the meat of animals slaughtered by their hands, or drank a certain beverage held in much estimation by them, if he washed a corpse in warm water, or when dying turned his face to the wall, or, finally, if he gave Hebrew names to his children, a provision most whimsically cruel since, by a law of Henry II, he was prohibited under severe penalties from giving them Christian names. He must have found it difficult to extricate himself from the horns of this dilemma. Such are a few of the circumstances, some of them purely accidental in their nature, others the result of early habit, which might well have continued after a sincere conversion to Christianity, and all of them trivial, on which capital accusations were to be alleged, and even satisfactorily established. The inquisitors, adopting the wildly tortuous policy of the ancient tribunal, proceeded with the dispatch, which shows that they could have paid little difference even to the affectation of legal form. On the 6th day of January, 6 convicts suffered at the stake. 17 more were executed in March, and still a greater number of them in the month following. And by the 4th of November in the same year, no less than 298 individuals had been sacrificed in the auto-da-fe of Seville. There's one more source with another list that I want to go over real quick. In the book, The Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition, beginning on page 37. It is interesting to know what were considered as proofs of a relapse into Judaism. 37 articles were drawn out, and the mention of a few of them is sufficient to prove how frivolous and absurd were the grounds which sufficed to deprive multitudes of unfortunate fellow creatures of happiness, property, and life. It was to be investigated whether an individual had made a difference between Saturday and other days by laying a white cloth on the table, or putting on a clean shirt or better clothes than other days, whether he had cut the throat of a fowl and killing it for food, or had withdrawn the sinew from an animal destroyed for the same purpose, whether he had eaten meat during Lent or on the fast prescribed by the church, or had abstained from food on the Jewish Day of Atonement or other Hebrew fasts. or used baths, cut his hair, or pared his nails on days preceding such fast? Or had he eaten unleavened bread, or used certain herbs in Passover, or procured green branches, or made presents of fruit to friends at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or drunk kasher wine that prepared for Jewish ceremonials, or eaten meat killed by Jews, or repeated certain Jewish blessings on particular occasions, or recited the Psalms of David without concluding with the words, "Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost." Whether any parent had given Hebrew names to his children, or washed or shaved the head of a child on the part which the chrism of baptism had been poured, or invited his friends and relations to dine before leaving on a long journey, or whether a dying man had turned his face to the wall, or had it so turned by others, or a dead body had been washed in warm water, or the water had been emptied out of all vessels in the house of a deceased person, together with a long catalogue of similar inquiries. Such were among the proofs of relapse from the newly adopted faith into the errors of the old superstition. Sad indeed was the fate of those of whom it could be pretended that they cooked their stews in oil instead of lard. And many old Christians in after times had to repent that their casual dislike to pork or shellfish had brought them under the suspicion of being secret votaries of what it pleased the inquisitors to designate as the impious law of Moses. So you see, the new Christians, as they would be called in English today, were those who were allowed to stay in European countries. If they were ever suspected of so much as sharing a meal with someone who would not convert to Catholicism, they could be arrested and taken to trial for the Inquisition, and potentially taken to the most extreme level of being burned at the stake before the public. That means if an adult child had converted but went to have dinner with their parents, or vice versa, if parents had converted and visited their adult children and they ate a meal that could be considered Jewish, then they could be arrested and jailed by the Inquisition. This information is critical to our understanding of the ethnic Jews, because these ethnic Jews were those who would become prisoners, shipped to various locations throughout the world as slaves for perpetuity. Even as slaves in Spain, they could not stay in the country. In the book A History of the Inquisition of Spain by Henry Charles Lee, Volume 1, printed in 1906, we begin reading, in August 1492, 9 caravels arrived there, loaded with Jews and infected with pestilence, which they communicated to the city, whence it spread through the kingdom and raged for a year, causing a mortality of 20,000. Then, in the confusion following the invasion of Charles VIII in 1495, the people rose against them. Many abandoned their religion to escape slaughter or slavery. Many were carried off to distant lands and sold as slaves. This tribulation lasted for 3 years, during which those who were steadfast in the faith were imprisoned or burnt or exposed to the caprices of the mob. Turkey, on the whole, proved the most satisfactory refuge, where Bajazet found them such profitable subjects that he ridiculed the wisdom popularly ascribed to the Spanish sovereigns who would commit such great an act of folly. Though exposed to occasional persecution, they continued to flourish. Most of the existing Jews of Turkey and Europe, and a large portion of those in Turkey and Asia, are descendants of the exiles. They absorbed their older communities, and their language is still the Spanish of the 16th century. When the fate of the exiles was, for the most part, so unendurable, it was natural that many should seek to return to their native land, and as we have seen from Bernaldez, large numbers did so. At first, this was tacitly permitted, on condition of conversion, provided they brought money with them. But the sovereigns finally grew fearful that the purity of the faith would be impaired, and in 1499, an explanatory edict was issued, decreeing death and confiscation for any Jew entering Spain, whether a foreigner or returning exile, even if he asked for baptism, unless beforehand he sent word that he wished to come for that purpose. When he was to be baptized at the port of entry, and a notarial act was to be taken. That this savage edict was pitilessly enforced is manifested by several cases in 1500 and 1501. Moreover, all masters of Jewish slaves were ordered to send them out of the country within 2 months, unless they would submit to baptism. Spain was too holy a land to be polluted with the presence of a Jew, even in captivity. Bernardez informs us that the Rabbi Meir wrote to Abraham Sr. that the sovereigns had banished 35,000 vassals, that is, 35,000 Jewish households. And he adds that of the 10 or 12 rabbis whom he baptized of their return, a very intelligent one named Zantolo of Victoria told him that there were in Castile more than 30,000 married Jews and 6,000 in the kingdoms of Aragon, making 160,000 souls when the edict was issued, which is probably as nearly correct an estimate as we can find. With time, the figures grew. Albertino, Inquisitor of Valencia in 1534, quotes Reuchlin as computing the number of exiles at 420,000. The cautious Zurita quotes Bernaldez and adds that others put the total at 400,000, while Mariana tells us that most authors assert the total number of households to have been 170,000, and some put the total at 800,000 souls. Paramo quotes that the figure of 120,000 households or over 600,000 souls. Isidore Loeb, after an exhaustive review of all authorities, Jewish and Christians, reaches the estimate of 235,000, 165,000 immigrants, 50,000 baptized, 20,000 died. And this is the view of the diminished number of Jews as shown by the Repartimiento of 1474 is probably too large an estimate. Some of these persecuted new Christians who felt that they could potentially be enslaved did in fact flee to distant lands. Many did flee to Turkey, and as we've read, they were still persecuted. But another location was Suriname in South America. In the earlier part of the century, considerable numbers of Jews sailed for the Brazils from the various ports of Holland under the leadership of 2 rabbins to found a Jewish colony. It throve and attained a considerable amount of prosperity until, in 1654, the Portuguese obtained possession of Brazil. Under these new masters, free exercise of their religion was not allowed the Jews. They therefore quitted the country, some returning to Holland, others settling in Sian or Suriname. Again, this text shows that they were free to practice their religion and still keep their customs in the Brazils until the Spanish took over with their slaving ways. And just as a side note, it probably wouldn't hurt to get your DNA results or the results of the older people in your family and see if you have some DNA that shows an autosomal match to Suriname or Guyana or French Guiana. I mean, it's pretty coincidental that we show DNA from this territory if we're just merely from the slave coast of Africa, right? I mean, it's just a question. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I have to thank Garfield Reed and Spooky Apologetics on the Berean TV channel for their attention given to this subject that kept the importance of Amsterdam, Italy, and Turkey, and Poland in the forefront of my mind while reading up on the history of the Jews. One thing that these books have done is preserve the gruesome nature of these Europeans when it came to their insane desire to annihilate the very existence of the Hebrews from the face of the earth, everywhere that they went. There was no safe haven in Amsterdam. There was no safe haven in Italy, no safe haven in Turkey, Russia, Poland, not even Germany. There was no safe haven anywhere the Jews went, not even Morocco or anywhere in Africa. Everywhere they went, they were despised. In some locations, there were kings and leaders that prevented the populace from piling up corpses. In most territories, they were not that lucky, though. This was from the 1200s to the 1600s. From the 1200s to the 1600s, they were more than likely to find a Jew in perpetual slavery to Christians with no opportunity to purchase their freedom. But in the 1600s, Holland became more tolerable, as outlined in the excerpt beginning on page 291. The Jews in Holland, the Costa Spinoza. The reader has already learned that towards the close of this last century, many of the Portuguese exiles found a refuge from persecution in Holland. In truth, of all the countries of Europe at this period of the history, none showed them such kindness as the Republic of the Low Countries. If the Reformation had done the race of Israel no other service than that of opening to them this place of shelter, they would still have been largely indebted to it. No dream of the imagination could exceed the wretchedness of the Jews in Spain and Portugal at the outset of the 17th century. They had to choose between ruin, torture, and death on the one hand, not for themselves only, but for their wives and children also, or the surrender of their cherished faith, which was in their eyes the surrender of all hope here and hereafter. Their only escape from these stern alternatives lay in a lifelong duplicity and imposture which must needs degrade them in their own eyes to the very dust. So, in reading this, being that this was the 1600s, when slavery started in America, I decided that it would be a good idea to search for Jews in Holland or Amsterdam. And of course, it didn't net much. So instead, I did a search for slaves in Amsterdam, and this image came up. Now, you know how they do us. They show us the typical dark image that shows what are apparently, these dull-minded individuals, unsuspecting N-words. But when I find these pictures like this, I like to do slight photo color corrections, especially when I find obscured images of black people in slavery. And this picture came to life. These brothers, they don't look like they're dressed in slaves' garments. In fact, I did a further search of the cleaned up photo, and lo and behold, this image is a Rembrandt painting of two Negroes from the 1600s. And Rembrandt didn't move to Amsterdam until 1631. And upon further inspection, the clothing being worn by the brother, who kind of looks like Esther's husband Jethro, these clothes appear to be of some type of regal nature. I mean, why would these brothers, especially if they were slaves, get an opportunity to sit in the studio of one of the most prolific painters of their time? Where's the history of slaves in Amsterdam? I mean, New Amsterdam, what we know as New York, only began with about 11 slaves. Could those slaves have been new Christians who were found guilty of practicing their old Jewish customs? Maybe they named their children an Old Testament Bible name like Abraham, or maybe they were caught putting their hands on their children's head and blessing them without making the sign of the cross. As I thought on this image, it kind of jogged my memory, and it reminded me of something else I read in the Review of Jewish History. In this passage, it says, the Jews dressed so regally that the Christians took offense. Then I remembered all the old pictures of Negroes in regal attire. And let's just say, one thing about us, we stay putting it on, if you know what I mean. But now it makes sense why there were black parishes with coats of arms that depicted what we were told were Africans. Turns out they were most likely Hebrews or Jews that entire time. Now, what I did, I went to the web page of Rembrandt's old paintings. I didn't find the two Negroes painting, but I found many images of Jewish scenes that appeared to depict European Jews, when all Europeans knew the Jews were a separate race from themselves. I mean, and we've read earlier that the German Jews didn't move into the area until the 1700s. And even if this is just some type of fantasy art, one thing that we know for sure is that according to this book, the Jews established their third synagogue in 1618 in Amsterdam. That's 1 year before the transatlantic slave trade that we were told about here in America. And remember, Rembrandt didn't move to Amsterdam until 1631. And regarding New Amsterdam or New York, according to the New York Historical Society, it was 1627 when the first slaves came to New Amsterdam, and many of the early slaves had Spanish or Portuguese names, and many have been Christians, which at that time meant Roman Catholic. And it also says that they spoke Portuguese. But to top things off, it was Holland where many of the Jews had escaped to find their way to the Brazils, as mentioned earlier. So is the European art that is now being displayed on the Rembrandt page being used to deceive the masses? It seems that slavery more and more has a correlation to the punishment of the Jews from Spain and Portugal, who found no relief running all over Europe. I mean, a part of me wants to even begin questioning if the pilgrims at Plymouth Rock were actually whites trying to find religious freedom. Maybe they were whites trying to find new Christians, because it seems that the black Portuguese were the people trying to escape persecution and find religious freedom, while the Christians followed after. Now, we found the Jews expelled from Spanish territories, fleeing north into France, Dutch and English territories. They were fleeing west into South America, Central America, or the Caribbean, and quite possibly North America. They were fleeing south into Africa. They were fleeing east into Central Europe and Turkey and Jerusalem and other Asian territory. Coincidentally, everywhere they escaped to, the Portuguese were the first to follow in most cases. This, I believe, is why some Negro families have unwritten lore of being in the land of the Americas as freemen and women and not slaves, being confused as Native Americans or Indians. And with that, we finally get to transition into the discussion on the transatlantic slave trade, because we even made it believe that it was such a terrible coincidence that the Spanish, French, and British, as well as the Dutch nations, had congregated on the shores of Africa, bringing with them the tortures of the Inquisition, the Roman Catholic missionaries, and a seemingly unsatiable bloodlust for individuals with dark brown skin.
Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing until you come. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Oh Lord, waiting on you. Can't do nothing until you come. Begging time, waiting on you. Begging time, waiting on you. Begging time, waiting on you. I can't do nothing until you come.
In part one, we discussed who the original Hebrews of Europe were and what the difference was between them and the modern day Jews, known as the Ashkenazim. In part two, we discussed Christianity and the blacks of Europe and beyond. So this finally gets us to the slave trade, or what we were made to believe was a 1619 trade of African bodies as cargo into a system of enslavement. So as we get into this, the very first thing that I think we need to have addressed is the fact that the transatlantic slave trade is what most of us know as a reason that black people who are descendants of slaves are in the Americas. Am I right? After all, the transatlantic slave trade was an operation that was very detailed. It was organized, and it was operated by the church and state, or at least the church and monarchy. And it started a long time ago, not as a trade, but as a canon issued by the monarchy that actually held the reins of the papacy. In the book, History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabella the Catholic, etc., on page 235, at the bottom, in the last paragraph, we begin reading. Under the Visigothic Empire, the Jews multiplied exceedingly in the country and were permitted to acquire considerable power and wealth. But no sooner had their Arian masters embraced the Orthodox faith than they began to testify their zeal by pouring on the Jews the most pitiless storm of persecution. One of their laws alone condemned the whole race to slavery. And Montesquieu remarks, without much exaggeration, that to the Gothic code may be traced all the maxims of the modern Inquisition, the monks of the 15th century only copying in reference to the Israelites, the bishops of the 7th. Now, of course, I didn't just want to stick and stay there. I wanted to verify this information. So I have a couple other sources that verify what I've just read. So this decree was a reconstitution of a decree or canon from the 7th century. So I went and I found sources to verify this 7th century canon. In the book Sephardim, or The History of the Jews in Spain and Portugal by James Finn, published in 1841, on page 118, it reads, "The 8th canon was that produced to meet the emergency. Passing over its lengthy and inflated introduction, these were its stringent enactments. By command of our most pious and religious King Urgica, who burning with the zeal for the Lord and impelled by ardor of holy faith, not merely desires to avenge the insult offered to Christ's cross, but also to obviate with severity the destruction which they savagely engaged to bring upon this people and country, that being deprived of all they possess, and these possessions both of the perjurers themselves and their posterity, being confiscated to the national treasury, they be dispersed from their homes throughout the provinces of Spain, and be subjected to perpetual slavery under those to whom he may assign them, and remain so forever, neither by any connivance, while they abide in the obstinacy of their unbelief, shall any opportunity be afforded of recovering the condition of freedom for those who by numberless transgressions are branded." Now let's just say I kind of got a feeling that there's a skeptic out there who wants to see another source with these words. So I'd like to add this one also. In the book, The History of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, from the earliest times to their final expulsions from those kingdoms and their subsequent dispersion, beginning on page 26, it reads, "Toledo held the following year, 694, instead of the vague accusation that he had recently learned by open avowal that the Hebrews had plotted with others beyond the sea to effect the ruin of Christendom, that council enacted Canon 8, by command of our most pious King Urgica, who, inflamed with the zeal for the Lord and impelled by ardor for their holy faith, not only wishes to avenge the insult offered to Christ's cross, but to prevent by severity the ruin they had savagely engaged to bring on his country and people, and the perjurers themselves and their posterity be deprived of all their property and possessions, the same being confiscated to the national treasury, that they be deprived of their houses, they be deprived of their homes in all the provinces of Spain, and be subjected to perpetual slavery under those he may assign them to, and so remain forever, nor shall any opportunity by connivance be afforded them, or recovering their liberty, while they continue abstain in their unbelief, for they are branded with numberless transgressions." You see, the Portuguese were the originators of the transatlantic slave trade. And what many of us don't know is that Isabella, the Queen of Spain, even against the word of her husband Ferdinand, procured the first Negro for slavery in 1501. In fact, it was at this time that all Negroes born within the Spanish territories were being enslaved. These Spanish territories also came to include the territories in which the Spanish had put up forts along the slave coast in West Africa. The author Charles Cookout Jones even confirms this in the controversial book, The Religious Instruction of the Negroes, on page 2. Account of the introduction of Negroes into the colonies under the government of Great Britain. It was in the year 1501 that Isabella of Spain granted permission for the introduction of Negro slaves into Hispaniola, but much only as had been born in Spain or in slavery among Christians. And in the following year, a few had been sent into the New World. In 1508, the Spaniards opened a direct trade in slaves and imported Negroes into Hispaniola from the Portuguese settlements on the coast of Guinea. Ferdinand V, by royal ordinance, enjoined a direct traffic in slaves between Guinea and Hispaniola in 1511, and Charles V in 1512 and 13. In 1517, Charles V granted a patent to one of his Flemish favorites containing an exclusive right of importing slaves 4,000 annually into Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. This favorite sold his patent to some Guyanese merchants for 25,000 ducats, and they were the first who brought into regular form that commerce for slaves between Africa and America, which has since been carried on under such revolting circumstances and so much an amazing extent. 45 years after, in 1562 and 63, the English entered the trade under Sir John Hawkins and carried Negroes from Africa to Hispaniola. And in 1567, Queen Elizabeth protected and shared the traffic. Thus, Mother Country was engaged in the traffic 45 years before the first permanent settlement was made in her American colonies, which was at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. The Dutch, in common with other maritime nations of Europe, engaged in the trade, and a man of war of the nation from the coast of Guinea in August 1620, 4 months before the Plymouth colony arrived in the Americas. This information correlates with the passage we showed earlier from the history of the Inquisition of Spain. But what really kicked things off? We've read how in 1492 the Hebrews were expelled from Spain after a decree was handed down that all Hebrews would be slaves for perpetuity, following or reconstituting a decree from the year 694. But the reality of it is that the Catholics were very adamant about forcing the faith on the people. In the case of the Jews, who had come to be known as enemies of Christ, there was a lingering suspicion, especially of those who were baptized. Unlike the tolerance that is shown in our current society for certain things, tolerance for any religion that was not Roman Catholic back then was very short-sighted. The Christians had the expectation that anyone who was baptized would automatically forego their family traditions and customs. When it came to the Jews, the suspicions were supported by the customary practices of their ancestors. Here listed are a few of the things that could get someone arrested in the Inquisition. In the book, The Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition, beginning on page 37. It is interesting to know what were considered as proofs of a relapse into Judaism. 37 articles were drawn out, and the mention of a few of them is sufficient to prove how frivolous and absurd were the grounds which sufficed to deprive multitudes of unfortunate fellow creatures of happiness, property, and life. It was to be investigated whether an individual had made a difference between Saturday and other days by laying a white cloth on the table, or putting on a clean shirt or better clothes than on other days, whether he had cut the throat of a fowl and killing it for food, or had withdrawn the sinew from an animal destroyed for the same purpose, whether he had eaten meat during Lent or on the fast prescribed by the church, or had abstained from food on the Jewish Day of Atonement or other Hebrew fasts, or had used baths, cut his hair, or pared his nails on days preceding such fasts, or had eaten unleavened bread, or used certain herbs in Passover, or procured green branches, or made presents of fruit to friends at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or drunk kasher wine, that prepared for Jewish ceremonials, or eaten meat killed by Jews, or repeated certain Jewish blessings on particular occasions, or recited the Psalms of David without concluding with the words, "Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost." Whether any parent had given Hebrew names to his children, or washed or shaved the head of a child on the part on which the chrism of baptism had been poured, or invited his friends and relations to dine before leaving on a long journey, or whether a dying man had turned his face to the wall, or had it so turned by others, or a dead body had been washed in warm water, or the water had been emptied out from all vessels in the house of a deceased person, together with a long catalogue of similar inquiries. Such were among the proofs of relapse from the newly adopted faith into the errors of the old superstition. Sad indeed was the fate of those whom it could be pretended that they cooked their stews in oil instead of lard, and many old Christians in after times had to repent that their casual dislike to pork or shellfish had brought them under the suspicion of being secret votaries of what it pleased the inquisitors to designate as the impious law of Moses. These, my friend, were the rituals that would be considered practice in Judaism. So no, it wasn't the Ashkenazi customs that are practiced by our European brethren that they themselves developed in the years following the Bel Shem. They are the customs that seem to have followed many slaves in the transatlantic slave trade to the various islands and territories where they were ultimately enslaved. But now that we've read that the slave trade included Negroes who were born in the territories of Spain more than 100 years prior to the settling of the New World, is it a wonder why the transatlantic slave trade has been given its own narrative? It kind of gives videos like this one more credibility within the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, so part two of slave ships are not real. Listen up, listen up. Look, so y'all telling me that y'all really believe that 12.7 million of us was brought over here on slave ships that held 200 to 600 people per ship, right? And this voyage that they brought us over on these ships that they brought us, it took 3 to 4 months for us to get here. And y'all telling me they had enough drinking water and enough food to keep majority of us alive. Out of that 12.7 million they supposed to brought over, they say only 10.7 made it. Y'all really believe that? Man, wake up, man. Y'all, they told me that too. They told all of us that. It's no proof to what they told us, and y'all.
I mean, did this video make any sense to you? Let's turn to some verified history. This book entitled Ouida, The Social History of a West African Slaving Port, 1727 to 1892, authored by Robin Law, is a compilation of some of the data and statistics surrounding the transfer of slaves from Africa to the Brazils. When it comes to doing research, I believe reading in context ties up loose ends where skimming just finds supportive information or what is known as confirmation bias. And it causes you to miss more vital information. And I'll admit that that's something that I did or that I am guilty of doing in the past, but I actually read this book. Now, again, just to be clear, this book only covers the period from 1727 to 1892. That's over 200 years of migratory data that's not included within this work. And before I forget, let me shout out once again Brother Garfield Reed for recommending me this book. For the longest, he's been debating others on the credibility of the 1747 map by Emmanuel Boyne. It shows the kingdom of Judah in Africa along the slave coast. He's argued a few times that there was no way that the French would call this place Judah. But there is little to no consideration given that the French are neighbors to the Spanish, and that the Jews were in the French territories for centuries also. And if you saw the first segment, you know that the Jews were running all over Europe, British or English territories, Dutch, German, Poland, Italy, and France, all north and northeast of Spain. They were also running to the Americas prior to the colonizing of efforts of the Europeans. We've heard mentions of their retreat into Turkey, Italy, which is Rome, and as far as Asian territories. Leo Africanus has left us a history that was conveyed and confirmed in the 1700s that many of the Jews who lived along the Niger River were exiles from these European territories from different periods throughout history. And not only were they Jews by blood, but they were also called Christians via religion. These men and women were converts to Christianity or new Christians, and conforming Jews who were just simply exiled for not converting to Catholicism. But if we turn to Robin Law's book, we see that the Portuguese had forts in Ouida, along with the English and the French, and at one point, the Dutch. You see, during this period in history, the Dahomians had conquered the slave coast, and they set up shop in this town named Ouida, pronounced by the locals as Wada. And it was depicted in the movie The Woman King. This town was located in the country of Ouida, but the book informs us that the slaves didn't come from Ouida. The kidnappers went inland to procure slaves for their European employers, who provided them with different forms of payment. This fort was the one place that all European nations could dock without any infighting. Remember that TikTok video I played just a moment ago? Well, this is what the record shows as far as the numbers of slaves transported per year from the slave coast, or from Ouida or Wada. Seems as if at the height of it all, there were just a little more than 12,000 slaves being transported from the slave coast per year. This should have the antenna raised for some people. In fact, because they were procuring slaves from the inland, the Europeans weren't happy about things. In the book, Some Historical Account of Guinea, its situation, produce, and the general dispositions of its inhabitants, with an inquiry into the rise and progress of the slave trade, its nature and lamentable effects, by Anthony Benezet. On page 19, it reads, "Here, the Europeans have the greatest number of forts and factories, from whence, by means of the Negro factors, a trade is carried on about 700 miles back in the inland country, whereby great numbers of slaves are procured, as well by means of the wars which arise amongst the Negroes, or are fomented by the Europeans, as those brought from the back country. Here we find the natives more reconciled to the European manners and trade, but at the same time much more inured to war, and ready to assist the European traders in procuring loadings for the great number of vessels which come yearly on those coasts for slaves." 700 miles, put into perspective, is from Charleston, South Carolina to Canada, and not just Canada, but nearly 20 miles north of Toronto. So no wonder the Europeans were unhappy. It took a long time for slaves to be procured, and clearly they were not trafficking inhabitants of Wada. When we look at a map, the 700 miles correlates to the distance between modern day Benin and Niger. But what I want to get to is the fact that many of the slaves, according to Robin Law, were able to move freely about. They were black men who ultimately came from Brazil, and having at least one white or European grandparent, they were considered mulatto. They had begun to be known as Christians, being called white men because of the religion and not their skin tone, as confirmed by this segment from Wada or Wida by Robin Law. The term European or white man, Yovo, in local usage included descendants of Europeans by African women, such as Mariki Lemon, hereditary governor of the English fort in 1850, who was biologically only 1/4 white. Indeed, the term Yovo was constructed in cultural rather than racial terms. Returned ex-slaves from Brazil or Sierra Leone, although of pure African descent, being also counted as white men who thus enjoy the privilege of Europeans. For example, when attending the king at the capital, they were excused from the Dahomian practice of prostration and were permitted merely to bow. In effect, as the French Catholic mission in the 1860s noted, the term white man was used to mean Christian. The European community in Wada in this period also became predominantly, specifically Brazilian. So here is another important piece of information that must be addressed. Even the black men who had gained their freedom and come back into the area of Wada were called white men because of the Christian or Catholic religion. So this understanding that a few of our brethren have when we read passages in old books that are referring to white men coming into Africa and having children with African women, it's more than likely referring to the new Christians, especially those who were exiles in these African territories. Now, for many of us, I know that this information is confusing because for our entire lives, we've been taught that slaves were either prisoners of war or prisoners who had been imprisoned for crimes committed. I've come to believe that this descriptor, prisoner of war, is just a clever way of describing the new Christians who had maintained their Hebrew customs and had become exiled from Europe. The natives of these African territories were paid to either make war with the suspecting camps or to imprison all of the new Christians who could be easily identified based on their differences. And as I just stated, the slaves were kidnapped from 700 miles inland, or the territory we know today as Niger. For many of us who have been reading and hearing information relayed since 2014 and what is now disparagingly called the awakening, one of the very first things we learned was about the Portuguese king rounding up children of Hebrews, stripping them from their families and exporting them as cargo to the unwholesome island of Sao Tome, or St. Thomas in English. This began during the Portuguese expulsion in approximately 1495. Returning to the book, The History of the Jews from the War with Rome to the Present Time, beginning on page 246, it reads, "Many were terrified by the tales of barbarities practiced on their countrymen by the savage inhabitants of the African coast, and many had been enfeebled by the pestilence which had broken out among them. No sooner had the 8 months expired than the penalty was enforced, and the whole of the loiterers became the slaves of the king. Those who were young and able-bodied were forcefully baptized and then carried off to colonize the island of St. Thomas in the Gulf of Guinea, which had recently become a Portuguese possession. In 1495, John was succeeded by Emmanuel, known in history as the Fortunate. His succession appeared at first to promise the miserable Jews some respite from their sufferings. He revoked the edict under which such as had remained in the kingdom became slaves. He refused a large sum of money which had been presented to him by some wealthy Jews and professed his determination of treating them with equity and mercy. In an unhappy hour, Emmanuel sued for the hand of the Infanta Isabella, daughter of the Catholic sovereigns of Spain, and they would not consent to the marriage except on the condition that their son-in-law should banish the Jews from Portugal as they had banished them from Spain. He issued a proclamation from Murcia ordering all Jews still within his dominions to embrace the Christian faith within the space of 3 months or to depart from Portugal. 3 ports were at first named Lisbon, Oporto, and Setúbal, from any of which the Jews might embark, but subsequently this order was revoked and Lisbon was named as the only place of embarkation. He dispatched a secret order that all children under 14 should be separated from their parents and brought up in the Christian faith. Such scenes of horror ensued as imagination cannot picture. Well, Robin Law also mentions in his work that nearly 400 years later, Sao Tome was still in operation. It was still Roman Catholic, and it was still staffed by black priests who I, in making a fair observation, will call descendants of those Hebrew children who were forcefully baptized prior to being enslaved. And having been taken over by the French, they are reported to know nothing outside of reading the Mass and conducting religious ceremonies. And in 1865, the Portuguese revived the slave trade to Sao Tome. 20 years later, signing a treaty to protect Dahomey as they began transporting slaves to the island once again. With that being confirmed, I don't think we should be any longer arguing who had Mr. Barbeau's reference correct in the passage that reads, Barbeau states that in the reign of Don John II, and about the close of the 15th century, large numbers of Jews were expelled from Portugal and taken to the coast of southern Guinea, that the island of St. Thomas, which is not more than 100 miles from the mainland, was populated by mulattoes descended from the Jewish exiles and Anglo women. It is possible that the Jewish type of character noticed at the Gabon and Luango may have originated from this source, but if so, it is unknown to the present inhabitants of the country, and it would have been somewhat singular if the Roman Catholic missionaries at Luango had not detected this circumstance instead of regarding them as a pure African family of Jews. You see, if we only consider the logistics, we know without question that the slaves of Sao Tome came from Portugal directly. So how would they be offspring of women from Angola, especially when you consider that the island of Sao Tome is 1,100 miles from Angola by air? This math just ain't mathing. It's not making sense. It would be a much simpler correlation when you look at the fact that these Jews in Europe already had access to Anglo women. Now, I tried to find the original source for this reference, but it's not available anywhere online that I could find anyway. But I did find a writing of another Frenchman, our Father Labat, or John Baptiste Labat. And let's see what he had to say about the inhabitants of Sao Tome. Now I have to use Google Translate because this book is in French. And I won't try to pronounce the name of the book. But here on page 4, it reads, its capital city is called Sao Tome, and more commonly Penosian. It has a castle surrounded by 4 bastions. Besides this city, there are several villages spread over the island, and according to the report of the people of the country, nearly 400 sugar mills and about 700 families of white Portuguese or mulattoes. That is to say, born of a Portuguese and a Negro or black. The mulattoes often marry Negroes and produce at the end children who, although black as coal, do not hesitate to call themselves Portuguese. And in this quality, they are raised to ecclesiastical, political, and military offices and are regarded as faithful, that is to say, nobles or gentlemen. Almost all the clergy of the cathedral were of this color. The bishop was almost the only white priest that there was in the island. When the night of the Marchese passed through, there on the voyage that preceded the one whose journal I give here. There's a very large number of Negro slaves in the island. They are baptized and all wear a rosary on their necks. It is a principal piece of their Christianity. In this same book, on page 35, it reads, "This is all the artillery of the city, in which there are only about 50 white Portuguese. This is the artillery of the city, in which there are only about 50 white Portuguese. The rest are mulattoes or free Negroes, who possess a large number of black slaves. There are a few villages spread out in the life and a good number of sugar mills, but the principal trade of all the inhabitants is to raise cattle from the island of the and poultry, to cultivate rice, prinnick, millet, maíz, manioc, to have a quantity of grass, lemons, orange, limes, coconuts, potatoes, yams, figs, bananas, and other fruits, which they trade profitably, both with the neighboring mainland and with the ships, which after having traded in Judah, Ardres, Popo, and other places of commerce on the coast of Guinea, come to buy food and refreshments, to continue their voyage to Brazil and other places in America. It also often happens that the ships which go to the East Indies, or which return from there, being upset by the winds and blown into the Gulf of Guinea, come there to take on water and food." So these slaves in Sao Tome, according to everything that we've read in the past about the slaves that were sent to Sao Tome, were Jews, and the writing of Jean-Baptiste Labat confirmed that any white families were actually mulattoes who were descended from Negroes mixed with Portuguese or white Portuguese. What we understand is that only Jews were enslaved there, and he confirms that the slaves are distinctly classified as Negroes who are baptized and wear rosaries. These were likely the descendants of the Jewish children who were baptized, then sent to Sao Tome by King John to be brought up as Christians, aka Catholics. Furthermore, he even provides with other info that I haven't been privy to hearing any other relators of info touch on. He speaks on an island called St. Anthony that is 30 leagues from St. Thomas, and there on that island are free Negroes who own black slaves. Very curious language when we know that Negro and black are the exact same word. So you mean to tell me that there were blacks coming out of Spain who held other blacks as slaves? This didn't shock me. I'm not in disbelief. We know that there were blacks or Jews who genuinely converted to Catholicism. We know that they apparently took things to heart. It's no different than what we see today. If we look at the political landscape during our entire history of our plight here in America, even today in 2024, politics have black people divided to every extent that they would even be willing to unalive one another for opposing their political and or religious affiliations. The point that I'm making is that there are some who are skinfolk and some even kinfolk that would prefer to side with the party that they feel gives them the status and the immunity instead of having to face the opposition. And sometimes they feel that siding with the establishment will allow them to protect themselves and those closest to them. And I'm sure that that's what's happened with some of the cases with these blacks who owned slaves on the island of St. Anthony. But let's move forward. So we know that these slaves were being transported all over from South America to North America. We find, however, that not only were these people being exiled from everywhere in Europe, but they were scattering all over, even into territories of South America, Central America, and I believe even in North America. This is why there were mulattoes and many blacks who have history here in the Americas before it was America. Let's remember what Labat said in his writing. Negroes who had one European grandparent was considered mulatto. This is why everywhere they went, the Spanish followed. Later, accompanied by the Dutch, the French, and ultimately the English. In Africa, the people of Dahomey were being paid to make war with tribes as far as 700 miles from Wada's slave market in Niger. All were being tormented by the Inquisitional and being made into Roman Catholics, being baptized by force before being hauled off to be abused in a system that was designed against them. It's pretty clear to me. What we don't understand is the significance of Christianity within the trade. We should, but we don't. We'd rather argue about who came up with the best philosophy or who can formulate a new ideology, and we aren't the least bit cautious of preaching the doctrines and passing information that isn't scripture but formulations by other men. And I have a most curious question. Is it a coincidence that blacks are the most church demographic in America? How is the black community more church than Roman Catholics, whose religion is the continental religion of the Europeans? Didn't the West bring Roman Catholicism to the New World? And I showed this book earlier, but knowing that the goal of the slavers in America was the same as the slavers who enslaved and burned Jews in Europe, a desire to make the blacks or Negroes, aka Jews, into good Christians, do you still find it hard to believe that it is indeed us? But whatever difficulties there may be in instructing those who are grown up before they are brought over, there are not the like difficulties in the case of their children, who are born and bred in our own plantations, who have never been accustomed to pagan rites and superstitions, and who may easily be trained up, like all other children, to any language whatsoever, and particularly to our own. If the making of them good Christians be sincerely the desire and intention of those who have the property in them and the government over them. Let us go to page 22. as to their being ungovernable after baptism than before. It is certain that the gospel everywhere enjoins not only diligence and fidelity, but also obedience for consequence sake, and does not deprive masters of any proper methods of enforcing obedience where they appear to be necessary. Humanity forbids all cruel and barbarous treatment of our fellow creatures, and will not suffer us to consider a being that is endowed with reason on a level with brutes. And Christianity takes not out of the hands of superiors and decrees of strictness and severity, and fairly appear to be necessity or necessary for the preserving subjection and government. The general law both of humanity and of Christianity is kindness, gentleness, and compassion towards all mankind, of what nation or condition soever they be. And therefore we are to make the exercise of those amiable virtues our choice and desire, and to have resource to severe and vigorous methods, unwilling and only out of necessity. And of this necessity you yourselves remain the judges, and as much after they receive baptism as before, so that you can be of no danger in suffering by the charge as to them the greatest hardships that most severe masters can inflict upon them is not to be compared to the cruelty of keeping them in the state of heathenism and depriving them from the means of salvation as reached forth to all mankind in the gospel of Christ. I mean, this piousness needed in instruction of the Negroes here in the Americas came at any cost, just like it had in all the years prior while in Europe. In essence, the Inquisition never ended. It just took on a different look due to the passing of the torch from the father to the son, leaving off the knowledge of who these men and women were and are, and why they were subject to such severe cruelty labeled as necessity. Ask yourself another question. If the slaves were supposed to be becoming good Christians, why were they forbidden to have worship services? Why did they have to sneak off to do so? Also, when the KKK was born, adorned in the infamous white hoods that the Catholic Church has worn for eons, why do you think they would burn crosses in the yards of blacks who stepped out of line? Their practices of lynching came directly from the playbook of the Roman Catholics. We have a hard time seeing that in all points made about the European persecution of the Hebrew communities or black Portuguese, that persecution looked just like the punishment of the same Hebrew communities of black Portuguese, which are known as Negro communities or African Americans today. The reason it was no problem for the various European race types to meet to watch the town hanging, the lynchings, the burnings, is because they have been doing it for many, many years prior to this current establishment known as the United States of America. When Negroes have their DNA sequenced and the various European nations appear as autosomal matches, it's pretty easy to reconcile that these lands are where their Hebrew foreparents once resided, and have DNA that had been swapped with the DNA of European men and women. It's not because of slave owners who were taking advantage of our women. It's not because of some random migration of a few Negroes. If you've done a DNA test, what European territories show in your autosomal profile? These are likely the locations that your Hebrew ancestors resided in Europe during a time when everywhere they resided in Europe, they were persecuted. The Black Sea or Baltic area, to include Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and other Dutch territories, the English territories, and Nordic locations are all places where the Hebrews scattered in efforts to escape persecution. This includes Amsterdam, which is located in Holland. There's a lot of artwork that can be found online being called Moors or slaves, but knowing that as the slave trade was ramping up, there were many Negroes running to and from Amsterdam, especially because of the persecution. It's likely that these so-called African faces are the images of our Hebrew ancestors who were known as New Christians. Look, we're currently seated in a pretty critical place in American history. When are we going to allow ourselves to unplug from the matrix? I'm not saying that our being the enslaved Jews means that we turn away from the Messiah. I'm not saying that the Ashkenazim shouldn't any longer practice the religion of their foreparents. I'm not even saying that black folks who practice any other religion should begin practicing something else. Heck, I'm not even saying that those who are not religious should become religious. I mean, we don't actually have to stoke any of those fires at all. And although my presentation had mentions of religion, the presentation is about ancestral lineages, not religion. It's about who we are, who we were, and what we've endured. Who were the major players, what the cause was, and what historical data we have that supports it. Yes, I know that for years, hundreds and thousands of years, people have been mixing, but that statement alone says nothing. Even if we were to focus on our mitochondrial line of black women or the Y-DNA lineage of black men, it wouldn't discredit the fact that was presented above, because the scripture and history tells us that everywhere these lineages come from are places that Israel resided. I don't know how many people will see this video or these videos. I don't know if shadow banning really exists or if the video will get metered down by the platform. I do know that the Almighty reveals things in His timing, and I'm just grateful to be able to share the information that I feel He leads me to. And with that being said, please share this video and all the videos. Every time you think about them, flood all the social media platforms, flood the inboxes of your loved ones. Share, and share some more. It doesn't matter if you're African, Asian, European, or Native American. You can also share it with your friends and family members and on all of your social media platforms, because this information affects you as well. I covered a lot here, and I know there are going to be people who want to have discussions one way or another. And if you believe I got anything wrong, leave comments in the comment box below. I really do try to respond positively to all comments. If you enjoyed the presentation, don't forget to turn your phone to the side and click the watermark down here in the corner. Also, please don't forget to go and either click the like button if you loved it or the dislike button if you didn't like it, because these things help the algorithm push the video. I'm sure that there is a wealth of information that is yet to be uncovered and presented to all that will come and hear. But in the meantime, though, thank you once again for joining me here at the Ruddy Brew. I hope that you can see that nothing is at all what we thought it was. But until the next time, peace.